Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Songdo, and welcome to this IU virtual talk. My name is Archi Rastogi. I'm an evaluation specialist here at the IEU, and I'll serve as your moderator this morning. Just before we get started, I just wanted to set the stage for the context for this IU virtual talk. And this IU virtual talk comes at a pretty significant time, right? I'm sitting here in the offices of the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. And the GCF was established and it was given a pretty wide mandate. And one of those pieces of mandate was to catalyze climate finance, both public and private, and at the international and the national levels. So it's just important to take a minute and a moment to remind ourselves of the context and how much that relationship between private sector and climate finance has changed and developed since the establishment of the fund. There's been a lot of activity and a lot of action lately in this space, in the relationship between the private sector and on climate specifically. You know, one could think of the events of May 26 and all of the different and unrelated things that happened on that day. Last week, the EU launched a proposal to limit its own emissions and cut its emissions to quite significantly. Greenland did that same thing a couple of days ago as well. Over the last few weeks or last few months, there have also been some very high-profile climate-related calamities, and many of these have been quite high-profile and quite, spoken about. In this entire context, the COP26 is coming up, and the presidency of the COP26 has identified climate finance as one of the key areas to address in Glasgow later this year. In fact, the COP presidency has stated, and I quote, "Ahead of COP26, we must work to unleash the trillions in private finance that are needed to power us towards net zero by the middle of the century. To do this, every financial decision needs to take climate into account." End quote. Now, in this entire context of developments related to private sector and climate finance, the board of the GCF is considering two very specific things. On the one hand, it's asked the Secretariat of the GCF to prepare a strategy for the private sector, and that's expected to come to the board at B30. On the other hand, it's requested the Independent Evaluation Unit, the unit where I work, to undertake an evaluation of the GCF's approach to the private sector. I also have the opportunity to be a task lead for that evaluation right now. And I can see the guest list, and I think for most of the guest lists, we'll have the opportunity to come to you in one way or the other with our preliminary findings in August, so in a few weeks. And hopefully we'll have a time to talk about that and go into depth of that evaluation as well in a couple of weeks. But before that, with so much going on, it's hard to keep track of what's going on and harder even to make sense of what's going on in this area. And in this context, we're very thrilled to have our speaker for the day and hear from her insights as a professional working in this field. What is her take on some of these developments? But just before I introduce her, just two housekeeping points. One, we really hope to generate a discussion today and to talk to her and to get her insights and pick her brains really on what she thinks as a specialist in this area. And to do that, you'll see in your chat boxes shortly a link for a Padlet. So on the Padlet, it'll take you to a link where you'll be able to post your questions, you'll be able to introduce yourselves, you'll be able to generate a discussion and talk to each other as well. And you could upvote a question if you really like it, and then we'll take it to our speaker. We'll prioritize taking it to our speaker. The second thing you'll see in your chat boxes is a link to a survey. And I spoke about the private sector evaluation that we are doing. We'd really appreciate if you take 5 minutes of your time. It's a very short survey. And so if you take 5 minutes of your time to give us your insights and inform the survey, inform the evaluation really, that we'll be grateful for that. And without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for the day, Denise Odaro. Denise firstly needs no introduction to anyone working in this field, but just for the sake of formality, Denise heads the investor relations globally for the IFC. She joined the IFC Treasury in 2012, so almost a decade ago, and has since established the investor relation functions to complement the IFC's portfolio. She's also responsible to manage the IFC's Sustainable Bonds program. She's been a central figure in the development of the sustainable bond markets for nearly a decade. She was the founding member of the Green Bond Principles Executive Committee, and then she chaired the Social Bonds Working Group from 2016 to 2020. And for this, she was recognized as a Personality of the Year in 2020 by the Environmental Finance magazine. In fact, one of the judges who voted for her said her expertise and passion for the impact bond space has been a key factor in its rapid development. Denise also wears multiple hats. Besides all of the things that I already mentioned, she also chairs the steering committee of the Green, Social, and Sustainability Linked Bond Principles under the ICMA, the International Capital Market Association. She's also the co-host, and we were talking about that a moment ago. She's also the co-host of Climate Biz, a podcast on sustainability and climate change solutions. And you'll find me talking about that and drawing from that throughout our talk today as well. In 2020, Denise was honored as the 40 under 40 by the National Institute for Investor Relations. And prior to joining the IFC, she was an underwriter at the MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. She's also worked with the Lehman Brothers, G Capital, and Goldman Sachs. Denise holds an MBA from Cornell, and she's also qualified as a barrister. In 2019, she was selected as an Emerging Leaders for the Emerging Leaders program at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. She's also currently enrolled on the Sustainability Leadership program at Cambridge. Denise, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really are grateful. Over to you, Denise. You're muted, Denise.
It's been 15 months, I say, of the pandemic, and I'm still getting a hang of mute and unmute. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and to you and your colleagues of the IEU for planning this event while you have, of course, your hands full with the review you mentioned of the Green Climate Fund's approach to the private sector. I'm very, very pleased to be here, so thank you very much for having me. Now, what I was thinking today was, I had mentioned to Archie just before we began this, was that I'd very much like for this to be a fly on the wall sort of chat. So it's about 9 p.m. here on the eastern coast of the US. So I'm in a relaxed and chilled mode, and I would like to approach this event as such. And so please, as Archie said, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Padlet, and I'd be very happy to consider those and answer them as we get to that point in the chat. But ready to kick off if you are.
Absolutely, Denise. Should we, yeah, we're in your hands now.
Okay, terrific. So I was thinking earlier today when I was reflecting on what to say to you initially, was I looked again as to, I remember being in Paris in 2015 when, of course, COP15 occurred, and the jubilation that everyone had. And then, you know, further on, a year later, when the GCF had its first operational year and adopted that initial strategic plan you had in 2016, what a phenomenal time that was. But you know what? The world has changed so significantly in that period. And we now, of course, have more science. You know, look at the last report from the IEA as an example. There's a lot more science pointing at the urgency of the need to address the climate crisis. And of course, this narrowing window of opportunity to do so. You know, we have also and remain in the global state of recovery from battling the coronavirus epidemic. And so while investors, in fact, and of course scientists even before, have been shouting from the rooftops about confronting these issues of climate change, now policy is fast catching up to global business, in that we are seeing echoes of sustainability, I mean, essentially in almost every aspect of business. It's just taking that term sustainability in itself and what it means, right? And simply put, how do we continue to develop as a global community without impacting our natural resources? And if you think about even the title of head of sustainability, which now we hear a lot about, but how new that role even is, right? So the first head of sustainability was only about 8 years ago, when Nike, in fact, and recruited somebody for that position. In any case, every aspect of business is now confronting this. And even the highest carbon emitting sectors are now acknowledging that the old model is dead, essentially. I mean, if you're not considering, you know, transitioning to a lower carbon model, you're not going to have a business, essentially. You're either winding down or don't care, which means you won't be in business anyway. So we are in the midst of this paradigm shift. And I think so the GCF in your most recent strategic plan, in fact, you identified your vision in twofold, one being to promote the paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development. And the second being supporting developing countries in their implementation of the Paris Agreement. Now, the private sector engagement is critical, in my opinion, to both visions. And I hope the GCF think the same, and in particular to the first, in fact. And so let me ask you all this question, like if you, from wherever it is you're sat, just thinking about this crisis that we have, and I liken it to, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and how the world changed so much, the introduction of the steam engine and the modernity as we have today. We are really now at that fourth Industrial Revolution, the dawn of that. What do you think the world would look like if only the public sector were expected to sort this out? When was the last time you saw innovation from the public sector? And I know that a lot of my public sector friends and colleagues might frown on me for saying this, but while you think about that, I think hold that thought while we have a poll question for you. And so my colleague Marsha will run that in a second, and I'm keen to hear and have an idea of the sense of what you all think is the difference between transition finance, which is, I'm not going to say what it means because that's answering the question, and green finance. So you should be seeing this poll now. And if you can choose the answer, it's anonymous, so feel free to make a mistake or just take a risk. I'm going to do one, and we'll see what the answers are shortly. Presumably, we'll all see what the answers are. Do you see anything? Because I don't actually. I'm not sure if it's my...
Yeah, I can see that colleagues are still filling the survey. We have 35 responses.
Okay, terrific. Terrific. So the reason why we asked this question, how interesting. Oh, wow. Okay, so obviously you're very clever people because there's a trick question here. And essentially the answer is the first. So transition finance is used to decarbonize project activities, and green finance is used to fund all of it. So by and large, it's sort of a trick question because transition finance can be argued as part of green finance in general. But the thing, I think the key point here is noting that all sectors of society need to decarbonize and to collectively reach net zero emissions by 2050. And the reason why I'm here talking to you about this today is because the financial industry is so fundamental in facilitating that transition in line with the Paris Agreement. So that's just my intro, and over to you, Archie. I'm sure you have some questions for me.
Absolutely. In fact, you anticipated one of the questions that I was going to ask you, whether you are seeing a paradigm shift in this space, because the events of May 26, where from Exxon to Shell, and the change in just the way in which investors are thinking about this, and you've seen very clearly a paradigm shift. But Denise, I'm curious about one thing. You're saying that the nature and the priorities of investors, and I've listened to your podcast as well over a long period of time, and one gets the sense that the priorities and motivations of investors are changing, and there is an inclination to invest more green. Do you find that the policies are still playing catch up to that? And if policies indeed are, there could be a space for public institutions such as the GCF to then enable that policy environment and do a bit more in that space.
Absolutely. So yeah, no, it's a great question. So when I started in this market in 2012, I would meet with investors and essentially talk about green finance and green bonds, which were almost non-existent at the time. And the world's largest investors would essentially say, that's nice, but I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Can we talk about credit? And now I mean, I start meetings, like literally not even finishing with introducing myself, and they say, okay, let's talk about green bonds and let's talk about, sustainability linked. It is, I think that, as for those who listen to my podcast would know, one of essentially the fundamental, I would say, success metric of these products is that it's changed this conversation. So let's take a step back and think how we got here. And, noting again, like I said earlier, not all of us are climate scientists, but we're all talking about this now. And, essentially, when I was a child, there were, we used to read as fables, right? And fables about, what essentially is like, killing the golden goose, right? So you have a goose that lays golden eggs, and you're like, no, I'm going to kill it and find out what's inside, and then that's the end of your golden goose delivery. Well, this is what we've done, essentially, with natural resources, if you think about it. So we've done this in various ways, right? And economists call this the tragedy of the commons. And when a resource is collectively owned, so no one feels like they have the incentive to invest in the improvement or, the sort of maintaining of that resource. And we've done that with water. We've done that with deforestation. We've done that with using, the oversupply of chemicals for bombs in the World War II, for using that as fertilizers and destroying and depleting our natural resources. So we've done that for a very long time. And we're now facing the consequences of this. Not so long ago, I mean, many of us were aware that climate change was an issue, but it seemed far removed from our daily lives, a noble but distant thing, a cause. Now, that is not the case. Every single day, we're either seeing it, we're now well aware of the physical, risks that climate change brings, some of which you mentioned, in the news today about, the rainfall in China. How do you have a year's rainfall in 3 days? People dying in a subway, drowning. I mean, it's like Armageddon, right? And this is just a taste of what's to come. The degradation, destruction of assets. We're seeing this across the globe beyond China in recent days. We've seen this with the rainfall and floods in Germany, the heat waves here. And so we're seeing the fingerprints of, the physical manifestations of climate change. And then on the other hand, besides the physical risk, we're also seeing the financial risk of climate change. And some people never really understood what that meant in practice because again, it's the tragedy of commons. But think about this. Who's paying for the damages here, right? So you have insurance companies and pension funds, all our pensions, right? Invested for 100 years, 50-year bonds, and with exposure to industries that are, experiencing all these damages now. So the rising costs, and in some cases, the lack of ability in itself to insure. I mean, there are places now where you cannot even get a mortgage because of, there's no one to insure. And those kind of areas owing to the climate change risk that we're seeing there. And in some cases, so the significant impact we're seeing, you mentioned Exxon, and I love that story. I absolutely adore that story, and the name of the engine number one hedge fund, I think, is just so phenomenal. Then we saw this with Exxon, we've seen with Shell, the courts in the Netherlands ruling again against them of late. So these assets on balance sheets that pension funds have had, banks have been investing, right, for years. They've given loans and all sorts to these industries, expecting returns over a long-term period, 30 years and what have you. And now the valuation of those kind of industries, the fossil fuel carbon, high emitting sectors, are now depleting. So those values, the write down on those assets is huge. So that's affecting your returns and what you expected when you gave out that money. So the physical risks are now really evident. And so once once policy, like we were talking about earlier, and the financial markets adapt to this new economy that has to happen, what we're seeing with this 2030 aspirations and 2050 that we have, a major significant shift will occur. And so does GCF have a role to play? Absolutely. Because, I mean, who suffers the most of all of this? in the end, it is the developing countries, alas, right? And you see that everywhere. It's people at the bottom of the pyramid who take the highest hits. So let me stop there and see what reflections you have.
Absolutely. And we will take the question. We'll come back to the questions in the Padlet in just a minute. I just have a couple of other things that I'd like to pick your brains on. One could be sort of, hard to abate sectors. And we think of also one of the things that the board has spoken about, at least at the last board meeting as well, is the challenge of integrating private sector concerns into private sector investments in adaptation and making adaptation profitable, for instance. Do you anticipate that that might happen like it has in general in the climate space, that might happen also in the future for adaptation?
So is your question, do I think that there's growth essentially in adaptation? Is that your point? Is that your question?
And do you identify any specific areas within the adaptation space where, for instance, bonds could be, green bonds could be of use?
So it's interesting. So those are two separate questions. So one being, of course, adaptation and vis-a-vis, mitigation and resilience as an example. So I think you then delve into a number of things. So then you mentioned green bonds. I think it's almost this acronym, this keep it simple, right? So for a lot of people, their first foray into any of this is, renewable energy, right? And that's like, okay, you see the wind farms and they're like, oh, this is great. And then, once you start going to energy efficiency and adaptation, then they start glazing, right? So, and I'm talking about people who are paying for this. I'm talking about investors who are, in the end, portfolio managers. Although now we're seeing that a lot of these investors are bringing on, ESG analysts and what have you. I think that, and by the way, I'll add one point to that, is that the success of communication strategies, and hats off to those who do communications jobs very well, the communication strategies employed of late has led to this major shift where where we are seeing people more about, adaptation and, essentially now transition, which is now the new buzzword, which overlaps, right? So you're talking about, as an example, for those geographies that have, as an example, put out, a ban on internal combustion engines by 2025, or sale of fossil fuel powered cars by 2030. I mean, that's literally around the corner, right? And so when you look out your window and you look out and you see all of these cars, there's going to have to be a fundamental shift, right, to this new model. So those car industries that in their projections hadn't necessarily put in the R&D to build out their EV models. Well, guess what they're having to do so now, because this is an example of how policy catches up with these sectors and makes things happen overnight, pretty much. And this is back to the messages to having businesses being prepared for this shift. So I think in terms of adaptation, there is, and IFC is an example, that was the smallest sector for us. So we had, our climate mitigation and, resilience, and then adaptation was, I think, around 5, was less than 10%, in fact, of our climate portfolio, but one that we see growing. So I think, again, just the summary answer is there's almost sort of this spectrum that begins with, coming into it from what is easy for investors to understand, where can blended finance make a move into, and then down towards the more complicated sectors.
Right, and let's pick on, and my last question before we turn to the audience, and I'll ask you, let's get into the area that you actually work in for your day job currently, which is the green bonds principle. And you brought out a recent update to the green bond principles. If you could speak for a minute about the role of green bonds in this area, and in fact, how they could contribute towards climate transitions, that would be really interesting for us as well. Okay, I should add also, Denise, that our last speaker for the last virtual talk was Sean Kidney, who you've called Beyonce of this space in one of your writings, and our discussant at that time asked him the question about greenwashing and the potential for greenwash in green bonds. So that would also be of a lot of interest to some of the audience here.
Fascinating. Okay, before we do that, can we take another poll? How about we do that? So I think we have another poll question, and this one is actually related to green bonds. So how much has been raised in global green bond issuance to date? So this here is, I'm curious to see what everyone thinks of this. It's a fascinating product, arguably one of the most successful capital markets products in recent times, and certainly the most spoken about, that's for sure. And when you think back to the birth of green bonds, which I'm sure that Sean told you all about. Oh, wow. Okay, let me just say that I should say I'm impressed, but I shouldn't be, because you are the GCF and you should know the answer to this. So very well done, because the answer is 1.3 trillion. And of course, it makes the largest proportion of sustainable bonds. Before I answer that question, what I would like to do is just paint the world of what sustainable bonds are. So of course, the granddaddy of sustainable bonds is green bonds, which there is the argument as to who issued the first. And that's between the EIB and of course my cousins, the IBRD, who did it in 2007. And again, here is a nod, I would say, to investor relations and communications people in general, the power of naming. Because the EIB called their bond climate awareness bonds, and the next year, IBRD issued the same thing and called it a green bond. And today we're talking about the green bonds market. And I think there is something to be said for, again, the accessibility of the way we speak about climate change and the solutions. To get buy-in, you need to essentially be able to have people understand what you're saying. And this is, to me, the fundamental difference between what had been occurring with scientists who talking about climate change. This is not new news. They've been talking about it for decades. But here we are all having this conversation. So green bonds has certainly done this in that it's brought the matter of climate change to a new audience, and essentially audience who have money to make a difference about it. And so between 2007 and 5 years thereafter, essentially this market of green bonds was a few investors, in Scandinavian countries, very committed to climate change, making that effort to invest specifically in this. So very, very small transactions. The average size was around 200 million. And then my team at IFC in 2012, one of IFC's strategic goals is developing capital markets. And of course, with climate change being a strategic priority, we look to promote this market and make it mainstream. And so what that meant was we worked on bringing what was then the world's largest green bond to market, and by that, incentivizing and appealing to a wider investor audience. So the green bond principles, which was then written after this IFC's iconic issues, which those two green bond issues that we did 2 billion. At the end of 2013, IFC was responsible for a quarter of the world's green bond issuance. So quite significant. It was an incredibly busy year for us. And thereafter, there was a lot of interest from potential green bond issuers, but not having a framework on how to issue. So on my desk, I would receive calls literally every day from, you name it, from a corporate to a multilateral saying, hi, we're thinking about this, doing this. How do we go about doing it? How did you do it? And so the Green Bond Principles was drafted to provide that background to issuers, so that issuers would know what steps to take, so that the underwriting banks would know how to structure the bonds, and also investors who were looking at it would know how to evaluate. So there are a lot of things going on here. And so it was written by market participants. So we launched the Green Bond Principles in 2014 and then gave it to the International Capital Market Association as the secretariat, and they remain so. So I currently chair the Green Bond Principles, and what does that mean? It basically means that I run the committee that governs the principles. So we essentially draft the principles, we draft the updates to them. We have so the committee at the moment has 24 institutions, and then we have about 6 working groups underneath that, and about 500 institutions that have signed up to use the principles. And I think even more than that, to be honest, that are not necessarily signatories, as it were, but that use the principles. So it is now the world's most referenced framework for green bonds. And we did the same for social bonds, which, by the way, I'm sure that you would agree, some of that is related, especially as we talk about the just transition, which is, again, we are transitioning to a lower carbon economy. So what that means is we're essentially having to turn the tap off on some of the very key business sectors that we have and employ millions of people around the world. Well, how do we do this without putting those people at risk? So a good example, if any one of you who've been to cities that used to be, steel companies or what have you in the heyday, or coal mines, and they are essentially ghost towns, really ghost towns today. Well, how do we shift on a larger scale, this is what we're talking about now, to achieve what we want by 2030 and 2050 without having those ghost towns around? So this is where the meeting of social and green comes together to form sustainability. And so sustainability bonds being the third pillar, which is financing projects that are a blend of green and social. And I can talk more about the difference between the use of proceeds model and the performance-based, which is the sustainability-linked bonds. But by and large, I think the goal here of these products is to grow and channel much more financing to green activity. And the role that the private sector plays here is tremendous. And I will underline that and underscore that by saying that the bond market is essentially the world's largest capital market. It by far dwarfs equity markets and loan markets. So if you're talking about financing in volumes, there is no way that you can ignore that. And this is why I think the green bond product in itself is just such a crucial element to channeling financing. And then, of course, you have other elements such as blended finance and de-risking, et cetera, things that the GCF are set up to do that we can talk more about.
Thanks, Denise. In fact, right the moment to talk about it, I'll read out 2 questions for you related to green bonds and blended finance coming to us from the Padlet. And colleagues, if you'd like to take the floor and ask a question to Denise directly, please do use the raise your hand feature and we'll be able to request you to take the floor as well. But for now, I'll just go quite quickly to Padlet. And there's one question on green bonds, the value added of green bonds. And the audience member requests for your view on the second opinions on green bonds that are supposed to ensure that the bond proceeds go to green investments. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a tangible value added in second opinions from your experience? And I'll also read out a second question, which is related to green bonds and blended finance that you were just speaking of, and which talks about blue economy and instruments. And the audience member says that in a UNDP event, they found that to finance blue economy investments, it was crucial that for countries in debt to have easier access to financial innovations. And the GCF seems to differentiate between blended finance, impact investment, and blue bonds. But from your perspective, do you think blue bonds bring into the SIDS or LDCs, the blue bonds, which is to tap into capital markets to fund ocean-related environmental projects, bring to SIDS or LDCs compared to blended finance? What's the value added of blue bonds compared to blended finance?
Such a fascinating question. Okay, let's take the first one on second opinions. And I'm going to do this instead of answering it directly, which I'm happy to do as well, is ask you all to picture this. So you are an investor. You have 100 million in your pocket. And company A comes to you and says, hey, can I have your 100 million? I'll give you 1% back in 3 years. And I promise I'm going to use it for green activity. Just take my word for it, right? And company A could be any kind of company. It could be Shell, or it could be Unilever, or it could be IFC. Is it enough to just tell you that? Or is it better that company A comes to you and says, yes, I will use your money for this. And by the way, independent party Y has this report showing that these are the use of proceeds that are predetermined, that we discussed together. And there's this, report that shows that I will do so. To my mind, I think it makes a difference. Do I think that this will always be the case? Perhaps not. And I think it depends on who the issuer is. So as an example, when the Green Bond Principles were drafted in 2014, it wasn't necessarily for all kinds of issuers. Like we within the sector of supranationals and multilaterals, it wasn't necessarily meant to apply to us. It was for the corporate space. And I think arguably, especially as we get into transition, so then the level of transparency and credibility is so much more important. So you need more disclosure to believe that company X, that today 90% of their revenues comes from drilling oil, is saying, no, we're going to move, but we need some money to move into this new, lower carbon emitting sector, but we need the money, otherwise we can't move. You need more transparency, right? So you need to see more disclosure from them to believe that that is the case, for you to give them your money. So I think for now, especially depending on who the issuer is, that is almost a necessity. Now, there are also some investors who don't mind. And they say, okay, well, instead of 1%, if you give me 10% interest, I'll take that risk. But by and large, I think for where we want the market to go in terms of integrity and transparency, having that external review is key. Now, within the Green Bond Principles, we don't have it as mandatory, but it's a key recommendation. And the reason for that just being that there are legal ramifications of that in various markets. And the Green Bond Principles is meant to be a global document. So we try to keep it accessible and applicable in various jurisdictions. When you look at the EU Green Bond Standard that's coming to market, it's mandatory in there. And I'm sure we will see similar attempts or efforts to the Green Bond EU GBS and taxonomy across the world in time. So will it become mandatory? Perhaps so. Is it needed? My personal opinion is that right now, this is what investors want, and it makes sense in particular for some sort of sectors. So that's the first answer. On the second one, the blue economy, I recently saw this documentary called Seaspiracy on Netflix and recommend it to anyone who's interested in sustainability. And of course, it's about the sea, so the blue economy and what have you. And really fascinating, in some ways eye-opening, I would say. Back to the tragedy of commons. Fishing is a very good example of that, right? A natural resource, a shared one in some cases, and look what we've done with that too, right? So the value add of blue bonds is raising awareness to the issues that we're facing in the blue economy. But it's far and wide, it goes beyond just fishing, right? Of course, I'm being simplistic, to of course even some of the economies that are wholly focused on getting their GDP from what is the blue economy and what the impact on those, the impact is on those countries. So financing through blue bonds does that. It's raising that particular awareness for that particular sector and doing the same thing that green bonds has done in terms of changing that conversation. So it's very different, in my opinion, to blended finance. Of course, blended finance can be applied to a range of things. And I think more so than anywhere else, where is it most useful is the developing world, where investors, in some cases, are reticent to put their foot in the water, as the old adage says. You dip a toe in and see. And what they're doing is doing that. And should there be multilateral public sector efforts that can help them put their entire foot in the water, or 2 feet, in fact, and eventually dive, that's what blended finance can do, is providing that layer of comfort and de-risking to enable them take the opportunity of going into this new foray vis-a-vis where they feel comfortable in developed markets. Because nowadays, the search for yield, sovereign bonds are like 0%. People are paying governments basically to lend them money. I mean, that's just completely turns everything I learned in my MBA program on its head. So fascinating times, but a very different, the blue bonds are a very different approach to blended finance. Both have benefits to them.
The next set of questions that I'm going to pick from the Padlet relate to the institutional perspectives, sort of moving from the micro to slightly bigger level questions. One talks about a meta platform for green or transition finance, where should there be such a platform where these things can be presented and shared together with opportunities of investments and all actions or projects for search. So investments and or participation in a digital, so it would be a digital format. I'm paraphrasing the question a little bit. The audience member is basically saying that we have so many platforms and sometimes it's not easy to find information on what's happening globally. Denise, where do you go for your information? How do you keep track of what's going on? So that's the first question. And the second question would relate to financial institutions themselves. So Kay Irene asks, they can see how climate change can pose real threat not only to firms but to financial institutions, and there's not that much action from the side of the financial institutions to match the speed at which the world needs to move. Are there actions that you're aware of that the banking sector at the local and national level is taking, for instance, on loss and damage? And such work is not always visible to the outside world, is what the audience members saying. And with loss and damage, I also want to get your thoughts on COP26 and what are the kinds of things that you're looking forward to from, what are the kinds of outcomes that you're looking forward to from COP26?
Wow, that is quite a range of questions. Okay, all right, let's take it from the top. So the deluge, right? So we are in an information age where there's so much information, some of it fake too, and we can talk about greenwashing when we talk about it in some time too, and so sensationalizing things. It's very hard to keep track and to have a constant source of what is bona fide information. I'm fortunate in that even though. So in my role as head of investor relations, not only do I basically cover the relationships with around 800 investors globally, including central banks, pension funds, commercial banks, etc., but also we have around almost 60 investment banks that provide services to us in terms of underwriting our bonds. And so I work with them as well. So I get information from all of this. And I think that by and large, I have a narrow number of sources that I rely on, and is usually based on the style of how things are written. And I'm a very visual person, and I think that I find that it works in terms of painting a story, and maybe that's also what my job is I'm an intermediary between the financial world and development. And more often than not, you would expect those two worlds to meet very nicely, but it really doesn't sometimes, because within the development world, we're used to putting out reports that are like 300 pages. That's our measure of success, is how big the report is. And within the financial world, brevity is key. So, meeting that need. So I get my information from very select sources, but I also like to listen to a lot, and which is why I think those select sources in terms of the books that I read, the news sources, and of course, podcasts. I'm a podcast host as well, and I find that entertaining. Some of the ways, but I'm happy to share bilaterally. I don't want to endorse any channel as it is, but I think I've already mentioned some of the sort of things that I listen to, and you will see that on the podcast Climate Biz if you check that out too. That should in fact be your source of information. It should be Climate Biz. And then to the question about financial institutions. So I talked a little bit about the financial risk, and I think that now, so when I was at business school in 2008, ExxonMobil was the largest company in the world by market cap, and now it's no longer even in the Dow index. The world has just so changed for so many reasons. And you have Jim Cramer, who some of you may know as as the Mad Money guy, who typically would go on his show on MSNBC and talk about how he loved oil. I think it was a year and a half ago, he started his show with the comment, "Oil is dead. Oil is dead. Do not even bother investing in it." So I think financial institutions are fairly aware of this, by the way, and how much exposure they already have. However, you know, the problem with a lot of the models we have is incentives are short term, right? So if you're paid on, you know, getting in volume of deals by a certain period, then of course that's what you're going to do, is do that. Having said all of that, I do think that what they are requiring from some of these institutions is a lot more than they would have, right? In terms of, would I give this institution now 100 million for 30 years, or would I give them 100 million for 1 year? Because I'm not sure what's going to happen to them in 10 years. So I think there is some change there. They're also facing considerable pressure in terms of disclosure. Of course, you got, you know, you have now, you know, for example, I mean, in 2015, of course, the Financial Stability Board put together the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And, you know, that developed recommendations in 2017 on how companies could disclose risks. You now have a number of institutions that are assessing and ranking financial institutions based on this. And I'm not even talking about this number of CSOs and websites that you go on to, that you can see each bank and how much they've lent to fossil fuels in the last year. And so, and I don't mean to just, you know, point the finger at fossil fuels, because by the way, there are other possibly even higher emitting sectors, which I'm sure you're aware of, and that people don't necessarily talk so much about. But it brings it to the heart of how this is so much an emotional area as well. I think that there is a lot of move. There continues to be. Now, you know, you have central banks and regulators that are now taking this on as this is part of our mandate globally, which some are arguing is mission creep for them. So that's also a big thing. By and large, in summary, I would say that financial institutions are having to make a change in more ways than one. And the last question on COP26, I'm very excited about COP26. I mean, obviously, the deferral of it was a bit of a dampener. But when I think about the success we had with with the Paris Agreement, I feel as though, you know, now, and it's funny because obviously it's in the UK and we've had Brexit and everything else, but what COP21 did was just so phenomenal that I can only hope that what has occurred in that time, and now we're seeing these NDCs being essentially bolstered, right? So let's see, what will COP26 bring? And in particular, in terms of the private sector engagement here, I'm very hopeful about it. And I know that the UK are doing a lot of work to position the UK as a budding sustainable green financial center, and hopefully we'll capitalize on that as well. So fingers crossed, and I think a lot of people are watching COP26 for this.
Indeed, and we are as well, because finance, as we know, is one of the areas that they've identified as priority for this COP. We have a hand raised. So Babita, our colleague, would like to comment. Babita, do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for organizing this. It's really interesting, and I'm actually in New York listening in, because I think, again, it's really good. And thank you, Denise, for such an insightful conversation. I think we're all excited about this area, and that's why I think so many of us are listening in from different parts of the world. And as we're excited about the growth in sustainable financing, green finance, all of that, we also, you know, are aware of the challenges around especially greenwashing. And so, you know, what do you think are the key challenges and how are they being addressed? Because even Al Gore just, I think 2 or 3 days back said, you know, this is the biggest challenge right now. And at the end of this conversation, what are the key things that you want to leave us with? Because I think that would be also really important, given, you know, the breadth of what you're doing and how it relates to all the different parts and pieces that we're working on ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So two questions, one on greenwashing and then key messages, right?
Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. So, so greenwashing, I mean, I think of this as, there's hardly a media house I speak to now where this question doesn't come up. And my honest opinion, I don't know if this is an ISC opinion, but I'll say it anyway, is that a lot of it is a storm in a teacup. And the reason I say this is because the sector of greening in itself is such an emotional one. I mentioned this before. And let me throw this to you all. So think of a project where it's a petrol station. And the petrol station at the moment derive their power from coal, as an example. I know it sounds extreme, but it isn't actually. And so they've said, well, we are going to stop using coal power and we want to use solar to run our petrol station. Is this a green project? Archie, what do you think? So does anyone have an answer to this? Is this a green project? It's simplistic, sort of.
Let's ask Andreas for his opinion on this.
Thanks, colleagues. I, as head of the independent evaluation unit, I'm not sitting in operations of the GCF, but outside of GCF. And outside of all this, I would say, of course, it is a transition away from coal towards a greener energy generation. So I'd say yes.
Thank you. And I would tell you that many of the people right now listening don't necessarily agree with you. And it's an example of how different the meaning of green is to us all, right? So some will argue, but it is powering a fossil fuel, supply center. That cannot be green, right? So the arguments, I've been on phone conversations where I've had, colleagues of mine, Nobel Prize winning, by the way, arguing that, enhanced oil recovery is green. And others are saying, are you out of your mind? Like literally about to hang up on this call. But the argument is that if you look at science and you're using numbers, then you would say, well, if this is in itself reducing GHG emissions by such a considerable amount, which could, by the way, be in comparison to, a wind farm, much more impact, then why is that not green? Okay, so there are various reasons why you could say it is or it isn't. And I think the reason I wanted to paint that picture for you is to see that this idea of greenwashing does range from that spectrum. It's from subjectivity in some instance to misleading to just a lack of education as to what it is. Now, the concept that proportion of it is actually misleading, I think, in my opinion, is actually smaller than it may seem. There are around, I think my last count was around 200,000 news articles about greenwashing. And actually what I think most of that is alluding to is actually companies and products that are being devised. They would say, creating an index saying low carbon index. And the low carbon index just means they're taking the best of each sector. So if you are a fossil fuel, and I keep saying fossil fuel, there's so many sectors that I should pick on, but they're just the easiest. If you're a fossil fuel generating company, and for some reason your carbon intensity is a lot lower than your peers, then guess what? You get into that index. And then that index is being sold as low carbon, even though it has, a major fossil fuel generating asset in there. So that is, I would argue, somewhat misleading. But then they would say that depends on what a low carbon is. We don't have clear definitions, and that is the problem. But also, how do you define these things, right? So I think especially with the developing market context, where you have people who are either using kerosene lamps, which by the way is a huge issue in terms of just health impact of those kind of things. And it's sort of, do you move from that to having, a light bulb that's powered by, some fossil fuel, which may not be the core energy, but what have you, to being in the darkness and babies dying because there's no incubator in the hospital. So it's a lot larger than it seems, but I think what you're reading most of the time is just the sensationalism. Oh, green bonds is greenwashing. And what people say, oh, it's greenwashing because it's not actually doing anything new. Well, even if you say it's not doing anything new, is that greenwashing? What is your definition of greenwashing? So when I'm asked this question, I often think, I just don't bother fueling the fire, because I would rather focus that effort on the things that we're doing to actually bring about material change. And I think this leads to what my key messages are for you all. And key messages are these. One, you know, the story that I mentioned earlier today, just the thought of being in a subway going somewhere and all of a sudden, because of the rainfalls, you drown. You drown because global warming has made it such that there's so much moisture in the air. You're basically in a place where you're getting a year's worth of rain in 3 days. That is happening right now. So that's a preview of what is to come. And it's almost, it's so incredibly scary to me. And my favorite phrase on this is that we talk about climate change in a way that is almost like a lot of people are just yawning when you're talking about the apocalypse. But it's not a movie, it's real life, right? So this is real. And I say that as in, of course, hopefully I'm preaching to the choir, but we still know lots of people who don't think it's real. But again, I think it's sort of taking it, my second message is, it's not something that's far away, it's something that each one of us can make a difference on. And knowing that, yes, the impact, a lot of us like to eat meat, a lot of us, people just don't like being told to change their lifestyles. That's the most difficult thing for a lot of people, even though they have the intention of doing so. But every little helps. And I think that looking at one's lifestyle, especially consumption, and just realizing just the one day generations to come will look back and think, how could they have done things like that? Like, as an example, you have the aptitude and the skill set to make washing machines last for 30 years, but instead you create it so that it breaks down in 5 years, so people buy a new one and they chuck it in the ocean where there's no away when you throw these things. There's no away, it's going somewhere. And that place seems to be, unfortunately, a garbage patch right now in the oceans. It's terrible. And so I think in terms of my last message is that we can all do something, and the roles that we play, thankfully, have gone from what was niche to what is now mainstream. So taking on that momentum, and you did say keep myself, I said 3, but I'll end with 1, which is that don't underestimate the power of communication and how you talk about these things. And my key thing is staying away from making something seem so complicated that people just nod, even though they don't understand what you're talking about, because that's where change does not occur. So for innovation to occur, and for us to actually start making these changes, which I think will happen, we all need to be talking about this as something that is happening to us today in our business settings and in our daily lives. That's all I would say.
Denise, we have only a few. Thanks, Denise. We only have a few minutes left, and colleagues, we won't be able to take all of the questions in the Padlet, but I will take on some of the questions that are voted up. And one of them relates, Denise, to COVID, and and how one could argue that actually COVID was one of those things that was communicated in a palatable way, right? Early on, there was difficulties with it, but overall, by and large, we all seem to understand the implications of it, and we're able to engage with it. And there might be lessons to learn from that, but that's not the question. The audience member is asking whether we should consider health or green bonds to solve this issue, and what implications in the post-COVID world do you see? What risks do you see to green bonds overall from COVID? And I have one more question that I'll ask you towards the end after that, after COVID.
I think, first of all, I think that you're giving us people, humanity, a lot more credit than we deserve on COVID. I don't think it's true that everyone understood it, and just have a conversation about vaccination with some of your neighbors and find out. You'll see if that's true. So in that, the pandemic was absolutely awful, remained so for a large part of the world. I think that 2020 and the pandemic did some things that one could argue ended up being somewhat positive. One is that it made us actually recognize and realize certain risks that were there, we were aware of. I mean, if you look at the World Economic Forum reports and what have you for the last few years, the pandemic was always up there and nobody paid much attention. And then of course it did happen. So the impact of that on the financial markets, by the way, was phenomenal, right? So we went from social bonds, as an example, being, the fringe sister of the green bond, to actually surpassing green bond in the first quarter of last year. And what we saw is that by the end of the year, we saw the highest ever, obviously, issuance of social bonds. And, you know, we are now in a place where the social bond, which at the time we were drafting social bond principles, people were like, oh, but this is, I'm not sure I understand it, and so and so. Well, COVID made everybody understand it in the end. It's basically financing, you know, let's just say SDGs. That's essentially what it is. And, you know, of course, healthcare being one. And the largest ever bond in the world, and I'm taking this back to Babylonian days, by the way, which is, I think, the origin of the first bond. It was found on a stone somewhere. But basically, the largest one ever is now a social bond. And the social bond, which saw something like, I think it was 300 times oversubscription. So just phenomenal progress there. So in terms of the relationship between green and social bonds, I think there is an overlap. Because if you think about social bonds as essentially projects that pursue a positive outcome for target populations, well, wouldn't you argue that having a greener world is that, right? But the way that the markets have worked and the way that the momentum came was that green was first. And of course, it is established, whereas social is covering this wider array of things. And so much so that I think even for some people it's confusing because there's just so much in there. But one could argue that pursuing a green world and green project is a social good. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. It's just the way that it's structured. So I think that answered your first question. And I don't recall what the second question was. But if you have, you said you would ask it afterwards.
And that's the final question that I want to ask you. Unless there's any burning questions among the audience members, for which I'll invite colleagues to raise their hands. But one of the questions that's been upvoted on the Padlet, it relates to careers. And an audience member is asking, what is your advice for someone who wants to work in sustainable finance? Denise, if I want to be Denise Odaro when I grow up, what do I do?
It's interesting because I think this is one, nobody grew up saying, I want to be in sustainable finance, because it didn't exist. Right. My advice to mentees always is to be open-minded and to think of your career as a destination. But your career shouldn't just be something that is so independent of your personality. I think there should be a good overlap with what your life's purpose is and where you get your income. And I always think about, growing up, as a Nigerian British, football was a big part of my life, as in real football, not American football, soccer. And I always thought, wow, how great, because my brothers are so mad about soccer, fanatical. And I always used to think how great it would be if one of them became a football player, because you would be living your dream every day. That's what it should be. So it's not whether you want to do sustainable finance, but of course, if in the end you have an interest in pursuing sustainability, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the financial part. It's such a wide sector. As I said, it's everything from agribusiness to shipping to, working at Chanel if you wanted to do high-end fashion. You can do it anywhere. So it's finding what makes you tick. What do you do in your daily life that you can find an overlap with the sustainability, right? And pursuing that. And I think that the good part of this whole nascency of this area, by the way, is that, particularly for women, is that there hasn't been so much of a glass ceiling. And I always make the joke that the reason why women are ahead in sustainable finance is because when it started, nobody really wanted to do it. They were like, oh, just give it to Sally or Denise. Anyway, and of course now, this is where the expertise lies. But by and large, on a more serious note, I think that the focus should be on where you thrive and then finding the sustainability aspect of that sector and just learning, because it's so much, everyone is learning here because it's so rapidly evolving. Just learning and making sure that you are at those places where those conversations are being had. Finding a sponsor, that's really important. Find a sponsor who if this is something that you enjoy and you thrive, likely you will be good at it. And then finding a sponsor who's willing to put themselves, on the other end of the line for you when that opportunity arises is what I would. And then the last thing I would say is listen to climate calls, because that would be a good way for you to learn what's going on.
That indeed is a good way. I am a listener and I can vouch for that totally. Denise, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We've gone 5 minutes over the time. Any closing thoughts, any closing remarks that you want to leave us with?
And just once again, thank you all very much. This was such a wonderful event. I'm glad that we ended up having it, as I said, as a cafe-style chat. My hat goes off to all of you and the work that you're doing, and in particular, as you are looking to do so much more in the private sector. And, you know, like we mentioned, blended finance and de-risking. You know, give me a call if you need any tips on what to do with investors and any challenges you may have. I'd be very happy to support the GCF in any efforts possibly. And last but not least, I wanted to thank my colleague Marsha, who is up very early in the morning on here and was facilitating the polls. Huge thank you to Marsha and to the rest of you, the IEU team, and hope to continue collaborating with you.
Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you, Marsha, and your team. Absolutely, we benefit so much from your insights and really thinking, you know, getting to understand what you are thinking in this space as an expert and as a passionate professional. We've really benefited from it. Colleagues, I'd like to remind you once again that we are coming out with the evaluation report of the private sector evaluation in a few weeks. We'll present the draft internally to the Secretariat and to a few colleagues, including the board members, etc. And the final report goes to B30. It will be ready in time for B30, which is not in a long time from now. Denise, once again, thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues, for taking the time to come and talk to us today, this morning, or the night for some of you, and look forward to staying engaged. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Going out.